This is an interesting book, although it might be, in a sense, remotely connected with an era not that distant, but uh, it this book, The History of Materialism Since and After Kant, written by F. A. Lange, it covers a very important debate in the history of human thought, in particular how we construct materialism as a philosophy, how its evolution through various phases and stages has been there in the history of human thought, mostly post maybe medieval, late 18th century, 19th century, and you can take it to the beginning of 20th century. Since before and after Immanuel Kant being one of the reference points or watershed in the how you can construct a debate of materialism. The materialism as previously understood before Kant, and how materialism not only what I should say got it transformed or transferred through Kant subsequently for posterity, and and uh, and more interesting thing which I would rather like to point out or rather emphasize is that in the debates of materialism, in the history of materialism, or in the way we construct knowledge in 21st century or 20th century, we normally it's shorn of any the consensus which is there, the underlying consensus of positivism, materialism, skepticism. Somehow it has engendered into sort of consensus by which we construe the sciences as such, without shorn of any ideological or other roots per se. But if you see it historically, it has not always been like that. So the consensus which is there, so I would rather want to revisit that consensus, even though not it's not as one should deny or disagree the content of that consensus, but it's also always positive or helpful to see the roots of the material understanding of all sciences and knowledge, and of how we construct knowledge as such. In the in the in the writings of this F.E. Lynch, how he has tried to give a chronology to it historically, but but in the process you can see how the materialistic or interpretation of world or universe or human beings, or how we construct our universe, has gone through various phases and stages, which not only involved interface with the theology, with interface with the medieval way of looking at things, medieval scholasticism, idealism, and maybe different terms, and also maybe most importantly how the medieval Copernican, Newtonian worldviews interfaced with Descartesian worldview, and how Leibnizian and what I should say Berkeley and other people, those I would not say they are characters, they are formulators, or how these various thought processes got assimilated, and there was an active engagement of how this uh, materialism as a philosophy, which is there, how it has gone not only from individual to individual, from countries to countries, and the subjectivities of even nationalities, how it when ideas went from one nation to another nation, how modulo some modifications uh, there were some subtleties which we'll try to see how he has tried to articulate these very things. So what I'll do is I'll read some passages or some paragraphs to my liking, which is always subject to, and try to see, read them, and if need be, try to elucidate them to my understanding. For example, if I start with his starting with 18th century materialism and its influence in mainly France and in Germany, how it got. So if I see it, how the various subjects, so how initially the influence of Christianity and the famous Copernican and church controversy, how it got somehow seen as a debate of rationalism, overzealous rationalists versus Christian followers of doctrine of Christian divinity. So how it got, for example, he said the actual head and leader of English unbelievers at that time was not so much Hartley, the materialist, as Hume, the skeptic, a man whose views put an end as well as to materialism as to the dogmatism of religion and metaphysics. So here maybe Hume being so it's not only materialism, it's also skepticism. So it will come later how materialism and skepticism, had a mix of these two are essential ingredients of scientific method. But even though Hume was partly critical of materialist, he was also critic of religion also. But the point to emphasize is like people like Boyle, Newton, Clarke, so who thought that world as a product is product of a conscious creator, but somehow they did not also dispense taking world as a machine, taking world as a machine, that mechanistic way of looking at things. So in the same way, departing so for example, in the sphere of speculation, English materialism combined with French skepticism, and the product of this combination was a radical rejection of Christianity and church, which in England Hume, Newton and Boyle have made such an excellent terms with the mechanical concept of nature. So this is what I was saying. Singular and yet capable of explanation is it that the philosophy of Newton should in France be made to further atheism, while it had been introduced in France with a certificate it was less injurious to faith than Kantianism. So when the ideas of Newtonian mechanism, so how the philosophy of worldview, when it translated from England to, so how it was presented as a more as a critique of Cartesian worldview rather than having anything to do with the acts of faith or the acts of that religious doctrine or whatever you might want to call it. In the same sense, for example, so in the same sense, so there have been people like Leibniz, Materner, Newton. So apart from how they try to explain the world, but world as a machine, but there are subtleties where things are not things just for example how it somehow also impressed upon us as as human beings. For example, man is unhappy, the preface begins, because he misunderstands nature. So the idea of a philosophical naturalism or naturalism per se, which is said to be all and end all. So if you go to any book of science and any book of material science or physical sciences, the word nature is very much used, because we start with nature and end with nature, as if nature is something which is hideous, and in it there is all things can get absorbed, all mysteries and questions start with nature and end with the nature. And such nature as such is a metaphysical dogma or enigma, you might say, in that sense. So this absolutization of naturalism, of trying to, so what it is, so its roots, we're trying to understand that those roots. For example, even in human affairs, when we say man is unhappy, the preface becomes merely because he misunderstands nature. So previously this nature was somehow interfaced with the ideas of divinity, god, religions, theology, philosophy, metaphysics. So how this thing got somehow the substrate of all the theology and mix of metaphysics and religion and philosophy, how it got crystallized in the word of nature, that even when people say that man is unhappy, perhaps because he misunderstands nature. So what is nature, or our understanding of nature, or our understanding of nature from philosophy of naturalism, which we will try to see. For example, from errors, the terrors of religion which brought about men molded in fear or fanatically thwarted each other in so, for example, what he said. So, five chapters discussed in the general principle of his view of nature, motion, matter, regularity of events, and nature of order and chance are the subjects which Holbach connects his fundamental proposition. This is what I was saying. Apart from Newton, Descartes, and other people, Metric. So, person like Holbach, he says that nature, motion, matter, and regularity of events, and the nature of order and chance are the subjects which Holbach connects with fundamental propositions. Among these chapters, it is the last especially which, by its absolute elimination of the last relic of theology, forever separates the deists from materialists, which in particular stirred up Voltaire to violent attacks upon the systems of nature. So these are different schools by which philosophers also saw or appreciated things. For example, man as a physical being acts according to visible sensuous influences, as a moral being according to influences which prejudices will not permit us to recognize. So, nature is normally seen as a mix of how we construe things from primarily from sense perceptions. Maybe sense perception is a later invocation from senses in a sense. But when we talk of moral order, maybe it's so people are questioning that moral order is not innately always existing in a universal sense. So it's also a sort of prejudice. So you can sense the debates of thing, how it's somewhat in a very, it's not that it's not that clear, also crystal clear, as it is in every human endeavor, evolution of any human endeavor, I would rather say. For example, again I'll quote Holbach. Holbach sees everywhere only the influence of theology and ignores the metaphysical instinct, which seems to lie quite as deep in our nature as, for instance, the feeling of architecture. It must not surprise us, thinks Holbach, to see the ingenious and unsatisfying hypothesis in which the deepest thinkers of modern times, driven by theological prejudices, are obliged to take refuge whenever they attempt to reconcile the spiritual nature of soul with the physical influence of material things upon this material substance, and to explain the reaction of the soul upon these things, as well as generally its union of the body. So even though the idea of soul, it's it smacks of how as In modern times, it has gone out of books, the notions of soul and spirit, because we have materialized in soul to the point that the philosophy of materialism has somehow even materialized spirit also, or soul also. So in those days, you can see the debate is inverse way. So he is trying to just so that it might have been the beginning of naturalism. So Holbach is trying to say that the metaphysical truths uh, they would want to rehabilitate matter within the background of that spirit or spiritualism. So it's maybe the beginning of how naturalism as a philosophy was developing. So this statement somehow just lets us to come to home this very point. And for example, and you can see the combinations of different philosophers. For example, if we remember that for a long time, Spinozists and materialists were considered synonymous, and both views were frequently included under the term naturalism. In fact, we frequently find a pantheistic turn in men who are reckoned the leaders of materialism, who may be surprised as the zeal shown by Holbach to banish the very name of God, even though it may be regarded identical with nature from the sphere of human thought. So the Spinoza, the God of reason of Spinoza, or uh, pantheistic monism, material monism, you can say it, which was the creed of Spinoza, was sometimes you could identify it with. So there are layers of materialism and material monism. So you can have a god of reason, or you can have a prime mover, or a god who is permeating matter and just rescue spiritual or some aspects of religious idealism or theism. When we can, and comparatively, there have been materialists who have even who so there have been strands of materialism who had some intersection with this Spinozistic, with the material monism of Spinoza. So you can see it. So in the evolution of materialism, we have different strands, where different strands may somehow also have intersections with how we perceive materialism as such. Thus, thus men ever prefer the marvelous to the simple, what they do not understand to what they understand. They despise familiar things and only value those they are able to appreciate. So, even though these abstract and abstruse notions of mixing the notions of divine or notions of unity, creator, with finding material monism, or materialism, which is to be seen in symphony with the divine design. So they might look abstruse, but what the author is trying to say that people might prefer marvelous to the simple, but they do not understand what they understand. They despise familiar things, and only those they are not. They despise familiar, and only those value those they are not able to appreciate. So the element of mysticism in these abstruse concepts, or abstruse formulation of those ideologies, which might look, which have a mystique in them, were more appreciable. Sometimes, even in the history of materialism, might have some genuine, what I should say, advantage of explaining some obvious things. So in the history of materialism, these things you can see how sometimes before materialism had won. So in the total sense, so people even rehabilitated some aspects of materialism which were wedded with ideologies or theologies or philosophies, which included how to combine Spinozistic elements of monotheism with materialism. So this is what I can understand from this. So again, for example, nature and her daughters, virtue, reason, truth, are finally invoked as the only deities to whom alone belong incense and adoration. So where does nature produce unnatural? The unnatural. How can the eternal necessity that governs all development produce perversity and wrongness? Upon what rests our hope of a better time? What shall restore nature to her rights if there is nowhere anything but nature? These are questions to which systems of nature give us to no sufficient answer. So even though this is also a cry of naturalism as well as critiquing naturalism in the same sense that so what we are trying to see is that where does nature produce naturalism? So naturalism as such is a philosophy. You can say it's a philosophy, but where does nature produce the unnatural? So the coming of unnatural. It's a question even in nowadays also. How can unnatural be accommodated when everything is natural? And how can eternal necessity that governs all development produce perversity? And upon what rests our hope of a better time? So in the notions of theological determinism or theistic things that good will always triumph evil, or how we construct the saga of events that in the end so upon what rests our hope for a better time? These are the questions to which systems of nature give no sufficient answer. We have attained to the perfection of materialism, but also its limits. So these are questions in which systems gives us no answer. So if nature is be all and end all, how can you also just accommodate the limitations of us in encompassing the things? That's it. That's what's part of it. So now we are going to see, for example, so how then does sensation result in consciousness? What is consciousness? In an individual atom, or again in abstraction, or in wide space, which then would no longer be wide but filled with strictly immaterial substances. So even though modern before preceding the modern debates of consciousness and artificial intelligence, and so the debates have been there in early 18th century, but somehow they are intercept in the way in a certain background. That's the point. But nowadays we can start from materialism to mind as a machine, or machine can mind as a machine be totally just we can work accordingly that way. So we can see the things the developments have been from there. For example, again he's again talking of Holbach and Leibniz. He goes so far. He talks of Leibniz, for example, Leibnizian Wolffian philosophy. For example, Christian Leibniz, he considered, because the German idealism, Leibniz was one of its promoters. He had some reaction against materialism, and for example, Leibniz profoundness reacted against materialism. It was German pedantry that did so in those who repeated him. So So philosophy of Leibniz is somehow not totally being subservient or what being converted to the philosophy of materialism. So how it he articulated it. For example, Leibniz, he got so far in psychology as to give up the old method of self-observation and introduce method of the natural observations, or method of the natural sciences. So before even trying to go how we construe scientific method, or even to understand the roots of philosophy, scientific materialism, methodological naturalism, we have to see these debates of eight centuries, late 18th century, before Kant. We are trying to see, for example, uh, if you go to one uh, not less paradoxal must it appear to the sluggish mind of man when Kant lightly and certainly overturns our collective experience with all the historical and exact sciences by the simple assumption that our notions do not regulate themselves according to the things, but things according to our notions. So it's not beliefs. Beliefs are more important than how from which the beliefs are constructed. So in the philosophy of, for example, materialism, for example, we observe that all systems that are brought to oppose materialism, whether they are called after Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Wolff, or after our old friend Aristotle, contain precisely the same contradiction, because it may be a dozen more at once. So in the process of in critiquing materialism, the critiques of materialism have not been convincing enough, in the words of the author. For example, Berkeley the bishop, D'Alembert the mathematician. The former looked upon the whole world of phenomena as one great delusion of the senses. The latter doubted whether there exists outside us anything corresponding what we suppose. We have seen how angry Holbach goes out Berkeley without being able to refute him. So, in the history of materialism, there have been critiques of material notions, particularly Holbach, and supporters, for example, of idealism. For example, Bishop the Berkeley, who, if you just read his papers on invention of infinitesimal conquest, the debate how he critiques in ghosts, taking infinitesimals as ghosts. So he was able to rehabilitate the debates of uh, idealism against the materialism, and it seems that he was not defeated. The way the passage says, he could stand his ground against the volley of the thought process, which was stemming from materialism. Again, for example, he was saying Hume, in his own way of thinking, stands as close to materialism as so decided a skeptic ever can. He stands on the grounds prepared by Hobbes and Locke. He sometimes explains the origin of error without, however, attaching much value to the hypothesis by means of faulty conduction in the brain, in which he imagines all notions to be localized. For that weak point of materialism, which materialists themselves know not how to protect, Hume has found a sufficient defense. In transmitting the transition from movement in space to perception and thought, he points out that this inexplicableness is by no means peculiar to this problem. So Hume, although Humean philosophy has been skeptical in its essence, and his famous how he formulated induction, but the philosophy of materialism and human skepticism, which I previously have said, which are the essential ingredients of modern scientific method and how we construe knowledge process as such. So in the history of materialism, the triumvirate, the trio of Hope, Loops, and Hume. So it's a deadly mix of materialism and skepticism, and Hume somehow could defend aspects of materialism. Though his philosophy might have been skeptic. Mm. If I remember that Bertrand Russell says that skepticism is not psychologically possible. Skepticism, as in human consciousness, human psychology is not tenable. It might be viable, but it's not psychologically tenable as a part of human psychology. You can see, is skepticism tenable or not? This can be a good from the conscious point of view, not from the point of view of whether the truth content or the epistemology is sound or not. The epistemology can be sound, but as a process of trying to just stand on as a faith which religious people or any people would want to have. They want to have some certitude. It might not be tenable in that context. For example, I'll come to the word of this important thing, Kant. Kant, in word, fully recognized two ways of thinking: materialism and skepticism, as legitimate steps towards his critical philosophy. Both he regards as errors, but errors that were necessary to the development of knowledge. He admits that former, by reason of its intelligibleness, may be more dangerous for masses of the people, why the later, by reason of its difficulty, which I was trying to say also. This thing has been also pointed out by Russell also, that if you become total materialistic, so by reason of its intelligibleness, may become dangerous. Maybe Kant has some moral issues, as when masses are going to accept materialism as a philosophy, the things start and end with material, and even though he was converted to the belief that skepticism and materialism are essential in the construction of human knowledge, but for masses, you can say it has its own difficulty. There might be issues of morality or issues of difficulties of as human beings cannot stand with having a skeptical bent of mind as a part of human. They cannot cultivate it as such. So that's why Kant has himself, he has invoked notions of like transcendental idealism. So he might be critiquing idealism in some with the heading mix of materialism and skepticism, but he also wants to take elements of idealism and just present it that way. So which is you can say it's a mix of empiricism and idealism, his philosophy primarily. Maybe empiricism, which is derived from skepticism and materialism, and elements of idealism, you can say it that. So Kant, who finds all truth in experience, cannot thus have understood the correspondence of things with the ideas. So this is a critique of Kant also, according to maybe the another author, for example. This sentence is critique of Kant. What I should say. And if you read Kant's system of philosophy, he has perforce used words like priori, a priori, posteriori, and what are analytical and synthetical statements, and what is subject and what is predicate. And when we construct truths of mathematics or truths of philosophy in general, so synthetic truths, so truths of mathematics are synthetic rather than analytic or truths. So it's another debate in the general philosophy of Immanuel Kant, how he tried to, for example, so there's one important and a very interesting point which this book tries to say. For example, there is therefore it is that the mathematical principles are as easy to communicate to the learner as they are difficult to discover. The man who scans the heavenly spaces day and night until he has found a new comet may be like to him who endeavors to win a new site for the mathematical intuition. But just as a telescope may be directed that anyone with sound eyes must see that comet, so the new mathematical principles can be so exhibited that everyone must recognize its truth, who is capable of the all proper intuition, whether by means of a described figure or of mere mental picture. The circumstance that mathematical truths are often sought and found with difficulty has accordingly nothing to do with Kant, what Kant calls a priority. All the proper intuition. So this maybe a sentence conveys the thing that if mathematical truths or Platonic truths or eternal truths, and when Kant's classification of things of a priori and posteriori, and if mathematical truths are synthetic judgments, but synthetic judgments uh, can have elements which are not necessarily synthetic judgment not have necessary elements which are a priori constructed with those eternal truths. So that's what he is trying to point out, that the circumstances that mathematical truths are often sought and found with difficulty has accordingly nothing to do with what Kant calls priority. So the a priori-ness of things, if it is connected with the synthetic mathematical judgments, and whether astronomical truths, they are contingent on the observations which we are making. If they are not matching, so it doesn't speak anything. It's not contradicting Kant in that sense. That's it. We will the very story of induction, mainly doctrine of a priority of mathematics and origin of necessity that attached to mathematical propositions from a really. That's it. So this is what he's trying to see. So now so how do we know the mental pictures of straight lines are just the same as real lines? The Kantian answer is because we ourselves cause this agreement not indeed by the act of our individual will, but the very nature of our mind that must combine with external impression in all our intuitions. Intuitions in space with all the fundamental properties inherent in it is the product of our mind in the act of experience, and for this very reason it's equally and necessarily inherent in every possible experience as well as every mental intuition. So that's what I'm saying, the empirical truth and the mathematical truth, how Kant is trying to make a peace between the two, and he's having his explanations regarding these things. So in the history of human thought, how John Stuart Mill, so there can be empiricists, how induction is as a thing, scientific induction, mathematical induction, how you can see it in the Kantian way of looking at things. If the mathematical induction and the scientific induction, if it's derived from empirical reasoning, so where are the how we can reconcile them. So this is how Kant is also trying to. For example, while the material idealism always leads to become speculations, Kant, with his formal idealism, opens only a glance into the depths of metaphysics without losing the connection with the science of experience. So that's what I'm trying to say. So how Kant was trying to somehow meld or somehow reconcile or what I should say synchronize these two strands of materialism and idealism in a peculiar way of his way of looking at philosophical idealism, or which you can say how our knowledge that exists prior to experiences or only through experience is able to afford us knowledge, while beyond the sphere of our experience they lose all significance of any kind. So anything which is not experiential, which you just so his thing was experience, and what is experience? So anything which is supra experiential, but it might have elements of experience. We cannot construct a supra anything supra experiential. It might have elements of experience in it. So this is the summum bonum. So experience as such will just reconcile the elements of idealism and materialism, elements of skepticism and materialism in what we call what Kant calls transcendental ideality of space and time. That's upon question whether space and time beyond our experience have no significance. So you can just see it that way also. So Kant, at any rate, so far justified as principle of intuition in space and time a priori in us. It was a service to all the time that he should, in the first great example, show that what we possess priori, just because it arises out of disposition of our mind beyond experience, has no longer any claim to validity. So experience is be all and end all, and the notions of these Platonic eternal truths cannot be devoid from experience. So whatever you can just you have to just a priori what is there, you have to connect it with what you experience. So your experience should contain those a priori elements of how we construe knowledge as such. And that experience, if it's arrived from judgments, if you pass judgments to them, whether analytical judgments or synthetic judgments, there is things. For example, he established the doubt whether space and time have any meaning at all outside experience of thinking finite beings. While he was far removed from leaving these limits and straying away from metaphysical speculation in the pathless beyond these absolute existence, he has more effectively shattered the primitive naivety of the belief in the senses which underlies materialism than any system of materialism could ever do. By means of Sigmund, the idea of causality against which whom had directed the solvent of his Kant to a certain extent attained his whole philosophy, and it was probably the supposed discovery of complete table of categories that decided Kant to appear as a reformer of philosophy after he had fully gained the snowslide. The idea of causality has such essential import for the criticism of materialism that the most important sections in the history of idea may well deserve a place in the history of materialism. Such essential input for the criticism of materialism that might have been more decisive. So this is a very subtle point. It needs more thought process. What he wants to say, the relationship of causality and materialism. Somehow causality, belief in causality somehow will somehow the idea of causality as essential imports for the criticism of materialism, and that the most important section in the history of idea may well deserve a place in the history of materialism. No, that's it. So I'll just maybe stop at here, and we'll continue with this thing. For example, in the first part, materialism and Kant. For example, he says he did not reflect that the traditional logic, owing to its natural connection with grammar and language, there still linger psychological elements which, in their anthropomorphic constitutions, are very different from strictly logical elements in logic, which indeed is even yet awaiting rigid purifications from the admixtures. So, how Kant constructed materialism and Kant's primologmena, and explains the truth and experience, synthetic and analytical truths, priori and posteriori statements, judgments, and how he would try to just somehow make peace with idealism and materialism, and somehow subsume them in his how he construes experience as such. So this is very much this thing, how he sees it. So I'll stop, and maybe in the next we'll try to see how these elements, Kantian elements, how then they transmitted and transformed through Kant in the next lecture. Thanks.